Chapter 19. Outside during recess, Ethan was tossing his banana peel into the compost bin when he suddenly saw Vidka was beside him. She looked flushed and a bit out of breath, and Ethan wondered if she was planning on blasting him into the garbage can again. "I don't really want to talk to you," he said, and he turned away. "Wait!" She dug into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper and a key. "Here." Ethan blinked. "What's this?" "The key to my dad's building and the passcode to the office. He's moving Inkling there today." Incredulous, Ethan stared at her. "What are you doing?" "I'm helping you get him back, dimwit." "Why?" "I'm worried about him. There's another one now." Ethan shook his head. "Another one? From where?" "Inkling. I cut a bit off of him." "You what?" In the schoolyard, people looked over, including Soren and Heather Lee. "By accident," Vitka hissed, shooting him a fiery glance. "And we gave him a little piece of paper, and it grew a lot. He's called Blotter. My dad likes him because he draws for us. Inkling won't." Ethan felt a flush of happiness. Inkling had stayed loyal to them. He didn't want to be there. "Anyway," said Vitka, "Dad says if Inkling doesn't draw, he doesn't get food." Her mouth wrinkled up a little bit. "And if he still refuses, he might get fed to Blotter." "Blotter would eat him?" Ethan said in horror. Vitka nodded. "I think so." The banana felt suddenly heavy in his stomach. This was a lot to take in. "Okay." He reached for the key and the paper in her hand. She pulled back. "You have to promise me, though. Promise you'll leave Blotter for us. He's going to make those comics my dad wanted. We need him." "Fine. I don't care," said Ethan, "as long as we get Inkling back." Vitka pressed the paper and the key into Ethan's hand. "He's in the supply room. Good luck. Give the key back to me tomorrow, okay?" She started to walk away. "Vidka," Ethan called after her. "Thanks." He hurried over to Soren and dragged him to a deserted part of the yard. "What's going on?" his friends asked. Wide-eyed, Ethan told him everything. "So I'm going to have a sleepover at your house tonight. We'll sneak out. We've got a rescue mission." Soren stared into the distance, unblinking. "Nighttime? A dark building? Dangerous? Gooey creatures? You okay with this?" His friend nodded slowly. "I think I've been waiting for this moment my whole life." In a strange room, in a locked cabinet, in a glass tank, Inkling knew it was only a matter of time before Blotter ate him. Right beside his tank was Blotter's. On the bottom were 2 blank pieces of illustration board and just a few scraps of comic book that had been devoured long ago. Mr. Worthington said he'd keep Blotter hungry at night, and if he produced, well, he'd get a big feed in the morning. "Still hungry?" he scrolled in pointy letters. Inkling had already searched every corner and seam of the tank for gaps or cracks, but he tried again now with the same result. There was nothing he could squeeze through. He couldn't climb the walls, too slippery and high, and he was getting weaker. Since he'd been moved into this new room, Mr. Worthington had sprinkled only the tiniest scraps of comic for him, and he left behind 2 blank pieces of illustration board, same as for Blotter. "Draw me something, Inkling," he'd said. "Last chance." "Hungry," Blotter scribbled now. He swelled against the tank and pressed himself against the glass wall closest to Inkling. Suddenly, Inkling felt him drag closer. He fought hard to back away. Had Blotter felt it too? They'd never been placed in this close to one another. It was like a magnetic pull. Was this their bodies trying to reunite? Right now, it was a horrifying idea to Inkling. "Eat! He'll bring more after you draw," Inkling wrote, trying to calm him. "No draw, hungry now." Blotter backed up and then slammed himself against the hard glass. His inky body boiled halfway up and down before sliding down. "You food!" Inkling retreated to the far end of the tank's quacking. Blotter gave himself a bigger running start and crashed against the glass wall again. Inkling felt the shudder through his own tank. This time, Blotter climbed higher, just a few inches shy of the top of the tank. It would be much longer now. It wouldn't be much longer now. Ethan had visited the Prominence Complex office a few times over the years, but never at night when it was dark and deserted. It occupied the entire fourth floor of the warehouse. The high ceiling was lost in shadow. The big windows let in pale wash of light from the street. Amongst the workstations stood giant cardboard floor displays of the company's most popular characters, most of them from Cren's series. In daylight, they were colorful and fun, but now they loomed like sinister stencils. No flashlight, Soren reminded him as they made their way deeper into the office. The windows had no curtains or blinds, so someone outside might notice the flashlight beam. Ethan wasn't sure where the supply room was, but he guessed further back. He should have asked Vidka. He led them past empty cubicles with swirling screensavers, rows of bobblehead toys, and rocked creepily back and forth. Soren wore a black troque, which Ethan thought was unnecessary. It made him feel like a burglar, even though technically they hadn't broken in. They used Vitka's key to get inside the building, taken the elevator to the fourth floor, and opened the door with the passcode. His stomach gurgled nervously. Soren grabbed his arm and he jerked. What? What if it's all a setup, Soren whispered. She gave us keys, but once you're inside, the cops are waiting. We get arrested and thrown in jail. It was a terrible thought, but he shook his head. Vitka seemed legit. Okay, said Soren, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Beyond the workstations was a long hallway. There was no windows here, so Ethan took out his flashlight. Soren took out his too. It was smaller and more powerful, as befitted someone who was always ready for the end of the world. Their twin beams illuminated several doors. The first few were bathrooms, but the one at the end wasn't marked. Ethan turned the knob and swung open the door. Shelves rose floor to ceiling against the walls. Some held books and comics. Others held reams of paper and toner cartridges, bottles of ink, and so many bottles along the floor were stacked boxes, still taped shut. He slipped inside with Soren. Behind the door, whispered, closed, and clicked. Where do we start? Soren muttered. There with the flashlight, he picked out a deep metal cabinet against the wall. Mr. Worthington wouldn't keep Inkling in plain view, would he? He'd hide him from the workers, right? Soren rattled the cabinet's locked doors. She didn't give me a key for this, Ethan said. The back of his neck prickled. Maybe Soren was right, and this was all a setup. In the distance, he heard police siren and looked at his friend in alarm, but the sound soon faded away. Soren flicked the metal doors. Not so thick, he muttered. Probably not a deadbolt. From his pocket, he took out a thick army knife. He opened one of the attachments, and it looked like a nail file. You're pretty good at this stuff, Ethan said, impressed. Skillfully, Soren slipped the file into the doors and jiggled, and then lifted gently. Something cricked, and the cabinet creaked open. Ethan shone his light inside. On the middle shelf, side by side, were the two big glass tanks. From each came a dark flash of moment. Inkling! Ethan looked from one tank to the other. In both were a couple of pieces of blank illustration board and a medium-sized ink splotch. Which is Inkling? Soren whispered. In the left tank, the ink was bouncing around excitedly and quickly writing on the board. Ethan, you came back! Hang on, said Soren, and shone his flashlight on the right tank. The other ink splotch was also writing, Ethan, it's me. Oh no, Ethan muttered, swinging the light back to the left tank where the ink splotch was writing. He's lying. I'm Inkling. I think he's in this one, Ethan said. Vitka said they weren't feeding him. He's hardly has any food in his tank. Neither does this one, Soren pointed out, and it hasn't drawn anything. Did you say Inkling refused to draw? Neither of them has drawn, Ethan said, checking. The ink splotch in the right tank was now writing hurriedly. He draws at night. He just hasn't started yet. Ethan frowned. It wasn't like Inkling to make spelling mistakes anymore, but he was writing very quickly. At the exact same time, both ink splotches wrote, "Ethan, it's me. Ethan, it's me." "Okay," Ethan asked them. "What's the name of my cat?" Both ink splotches quivered, but made no reply. Why aren't you writing?" Ethan demanded. The splotch on the left wrote, "If I started writing, he'll copy me." Ethan grabbed a file folder from the shelf and slid it between the two glass tanks. Now Inkling and Blotter couldn't see each other. "There," he said, "go." Right away, the splotch on the left wrote Rickman. In the right tank, the splotch swirled and fumed. "Don't you know?" Soren asked him. Blotter swelled and belched ink against the side of the tank. "Blarg! What a stupid question!" Only now did Ethan notice the slight red tinge on his splotch darkness, farting out little bits of ink behind him. Blotter propelled himself against the tank and slammed against the side. "Gimme more food, hungry." Ethan wrinkled his nose. He felt like he could almost smell Blotter. Ethan turned away from him, reached down into the left tank, and lifted out the board with Inkling on it. "Thank you, Ethan. Thank you for coming to get me. Sorry it took so long." Inkling slid eagerly onto the floor, eagerly slid onto his hand, and Ethan felt the familiar and strangely comforting cool breeze against his skin. In his tank, Blotter was writing in huge, angry red letters, "Hey, hey, it's me, my food." Ethan felt Inkling quake against his skin. "Let's get out of here." "Yeah," Soren said, but he kept his flashlight on Blotter's tank because the ink was swelling and growing like squid ink filling an aquarium. Soren squeaked. Ethan turned back. Blotter hurled himself against the sides of the tank, back and forth, and on the fourth try, the inky body crested the side. Like a huge tentacle, Blotter hung himself out the tank and across the room. Ethan tried to track him with a flashlight, but lost sight of him when he hit the shelves. "Can you see him?" he asked Soren. The beams darted frantically. "No, come on, let's go." Soren ran, Ethan at his heels, slamming the storage door behind them. Racing through the dark office, Ethan kept looking back over his shoulder. He had a terrible creeping feeling at the base of his skull. Blotter was just ink, only ink. But he never forgot what Inkling could do if he climbed onto his face. He rushed past life-size, real displays of cred, and all the shadows suddenly poured off and puddled on the floor in front of him. "Blotter," he shouted, swerving into the office kitchen. The oily mess boiled toward him, swirled around his shoe and up his ankle. Blotter's touch wasn't as cool gust like Inkling's. It was hot, clammy hand. "Soren, he's on me!" He knew what Blotter really wanted. Inkling. He wanted to eat him. Ethan slammed his hand down on the counter near the sink and whispered, "Inkling, get off me! Hide!" The moment he saw Inkling's shadow on the counter, he stepped clear. Blotter swirled up his leg like a sweaty tornado. He smacked at Blotter, and Soren did too, but the red-tinted ink just swelled past his fists and fingers. "How do we get him off?" Soren asked helplessly. "I don't know." Blotter covered so much of him now. When the ink reached his jacket, Ethan quickly shrugged it off and tossed it on the floor where it grazed Soren's shoe. In a second, Blotter surged up Soren's leg and encircled his chest. "It's on me! It's on me!" Soren bellowed, his eyes wider than ever before. He swatted uselessly at the swirling shadow. In desperation, Ethan grabbed a spray bottle from the kitchen counter and squirted at Blotter. A blast of cleaning fluid hit Blotter and made him pause. A tiny little bit of him began to drip down Soren's leg. "I think it works," Soren said. Ethan sprayed again and again, but it got too close, and Blotter leaped onto the bottle itself and poured across it. Ethan hurled it across the office, but it was too late. Already Blotter was on his hand, his arm, his shoulder, then his face. Ethan shouted, but was silenced because his mouth was covered. The seconds later, his nostrils. He couldn't take a breath. He couldn't let one out. He couldn't make a sound. Ethan felt like he was going to explode and crumple all at once. "Blotter, stop it!" Soren was shouting, and to Ethan it sounded like a long way off because Blotter must have been covering his ears too. Now too. He failed he frailed around, swatting himself as if he were being swarmed by hornets. All he could think of was breathe, breathe, but he couldn't. Inkling saw Ethan stagger against the kitchen counter, bladder covering his head like an executioner mask. Inkling surged toward him. It was easy to get Bladder's attention. The closer he got, the more Inkling felt that strange magnetic force trying to pull them together. Bladder must have noticed it too, because he seeped off Ethan's face to his shoulder. Ethan grasped, looked wildly around, his hands flying to his face. Inkling's attention was fixed on Blotter as he oozed down Ethan's arm toward the counter. Inkling retreated and bumped into a big cleaning sponge. It started to slurp him into a yellow foam, but Inkling fought hard and pulled away. He looked back. Blotter swirled around Ethan's wrist, building up speed, and then flung himself through the air right toward Inkling. Inkling was speedy, and he darted out of the way. Blotter landed right on top of the sponge. Before he could flow across it, he was slurped down into someone in quicksand. The yellow sponge turned dark reddish black. He was trapped in the sponge, Shorn shouted, pointing. Come on, Inkling, Ethan said. Inkling surged across the counter onto Ethan's outstretched hand, and moments later, he was in a cozy safety of Ethan's pocket. He knew the boys were running. He felt a jarring thud as Ethan tripped and fell. You okay? He heard Soren ask, and felt Ethan hauled to his feet. More running. A door swooshed shut behind them, pounding footfalls on stairs, another door, and then it was outside in the cool night air.